Karen Lewis is an associate professor of architecture at The Ohio State University, whose research and teaching address how visual and information systems shape the architectural, territorial, and infrastructural space they create and inhabit. She theorizes the entanglement of how these spaces rely upon and embed information into their structures, systems, and organizational logics through design and writing. As an undergraduate at Wellesley College, Professor Lewis was introduced to complex spatial mapping when studying astronomy. Star charts, stellar classification tables, and other graphics used to describe complex multidimensional spaces inspired her research into how graphics organize space. As Associate Professor of Architecture at The Ohio State University, Professor Lewis has expanded her research in the graphics of spatial complexity, turning her attention to the stories hidden within archives. She has held fellowships at Dumbarton Oaks, the Newberry Library, and through the National Endowment for the Humanities to study 19th century visualization strategies, maps, and graphic tools of the transcontinental American West, with a focus on the visualizations of the Army Corps of Topographic Engineers. Currently, Professor Lewis's research explores the ways the Underground Railroad is described across space and interpretation using architectural representation to propose critical counter-narratives. Her visualizations of the Underground Railroad was featured in 2022 in Crossings, Mapping American Journeys, an exhibition at the Newberry Library, which visualized 3 stories of men and women who escaped slavery and created their underground railroads. By expanding archival narratives, researching historical maps and records, and linking architectural, topographic, and urban conditions across current landscapes, the mapping project gives insight into both the performance of those who created their paths out of slavery, as well as cartographic tools that engage research, design, and audience participation. So let's please welcome Karen.
Well, thank you very, very much. It is truly an honor to be here, and I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to everybody for inviting me to give this very, very special keynote address. I want to thank Katie and everybody at the Rumsey Map Center. I also, of course, there's Laura, Christina, Stace, now Evan. Not only did Evan start his job yesterday, but he began our interaction by parking my car for me today. Truly above and beyond. Totally amazing. But I also want to give a special thanks to Dr. Jordana Dim, as well as Dr. James Ackerman at the Newberry Library. I believe Jordana actually introduced me to Katie, so it's very lovely to have all of this connection. My absolutely marvelous Ohio State collaborators, John Davis and Matthias van Massacres, who kind of helped me think of this work in the very, very earliest stages of our teaching. And then, of course, all of the absolutely fantastic students that have been participating in these conversations for so long. It's really quite a privilege to stand here tonight and share everything with you. By way of an introduction, I want to share that I'm an architect who loves to make maps. So maps for me hold many threads of research, whether it be for imagining a new green space system for my hometown of Newtown, Connecticut. The maps connect my thinking about larger systems, public spaces, to galvanize design proposals. And these proposals can be at the scale of a town or a memorial landscape for the victims of the Sandy Hook massacre, or they can even be within the scale of a neighborhood, a Queensway project that reaches to even a larger urban kind of process. You can see through some of these examples of some of my work that my approach to mapping is about sort of claiming and understanding a type of space that can then be entangled into an infrastructural and spatial system. Oftentimes the map, in the case of this image, can become quite literally the site for this model. So the map of the transit systems in New York become the literal base for the model that then starts to bring forward these entanglements, looking at how spaces and the articulation of data can be just as much of a material information as any other kind of architectural material, creating spaces that are both sort of otherworldly, if you will, and also connecting even to spaces beyond what we might imagine already. So my earliest beginnings in astronomy, thinking about ways that we map, chart, and collect that information. Projecting the future has always been the purview of architecture. But recently, I found myself finding a lot of fruitful and very intellectually rigorous information in the past, if you will. And so thinking about systems of movement and different ways that we could start to imagine these spaces from the maps of, for example, the Oregon Trail, which I then brought forward into a perspective drawing, layering information on top of one another, and now even into my own current research about the Underground Railroad. And to the Underground Railroad, this is where the map, the archive, the data visualization, the spatial information form a deep mapping. And the map becomes the tool with which to gather, assemble, and organize this information. And you can see all of the different ways that I've tried to chart my thinking about what goes into the image. These archival and graphic practices have coalesced into my recent work on the mapping of the Underground Railroad, which I will speak with you about tonight. And there are 3 projects within this theme that I will share with you. The first is the story of an historic house in Columbus, Ohio, that holds several legacy imaginaries that are very sort of potent within the state of Ohio and the Ohio State University. And these stories challenge the ways we look at how we speak about slavery and what stories we carry forward to the present. The second is a project I developed for an exhibition at the Newberry Library curated by Jim Ackerman, Crossings, Mapping American Journeys, and this short animation to describe how freedom seekers map their way from enslavement to liberation. And then finally, very, very recent project, like just finished it 2 weeks ago, of counter mapping of the old Maysville Road, which linked Lexington, Kentucky to Maysville, Kentucky, also known as Limestone at the time of this map, and served as a conduit for both enslavement as well as liberation from slavery. But the cartographic pivot point between all of these threads can be traced back to this map, drawn by Wilbur Henry Siebert at the end of the 19th century. Like myself, Wilbur Siebert was a professor at The Ohio State University, and in 1898, he published a book containing maps that depicted the first systemized vision of the routes enslaved people used to escape across the Ohio River and into the free North in Canada. Siebert spent decades of his career interviewing Black men and women who fled slavery through Ohio, as well as recorded accounts of the agents, nearly 3,000 white landowners who sheltered fugitives in their homes. Though not the first recording of those who escaped slavery, that work was completed by a Black man from Philadelphia named William Still. Siebert's work is acknowledged as the first academic practice. His research, questionnaires, letters, written notes, and interviews are digitized and preserved by the State Archive. Siebert's map, while compelling and seemingly well documented and recorded, after all, Siebert collected all of those testimonies through painstaking interviews for most of his career, leaves many stories untold, which is the criticism of his scholarship. Though he did tremendous work to interview, collect, and map the memories and perspectives of primarily the white Quaker Ohioans who participated or thought that they had participated in the Underground Railroad, he tended to downplay the work of the Black men and women who downplay the work of the Black men and women who were escaping slavery. This painting by Charles T. Weber was exhibited at the Chicago World's Fair, and Siebert went to the World's Fair and saw this painting when he visited the Columbia Expo in 1893 during his first years of teaching at Ohio State. And this image kind of upholds that imaginary that the Underground Railroad was there to serve the sort of beleaguered, weary Black men and women who were escaping slavery, and it was the white homeowners who were bringing them through and sheltering them and helping them. If Siebert's map doesn't communicate the breadth of these routes, then how can we untangle the experiences from this line? Which leads me into my first research question about the Underground Railroad routes themselves, which is what types of spaces comprise the Underground Railroad? So if the Underground Railroad was not just about these houses owned by certain people, but what was it then? How did it form? What were the buildings? What were the structures, the landscapes, the corn cribs, the barns, the rivers, attics, and even caves that formed the Underground Railroad? And could we find what that spatial paradigm of the Underground Railroad would be? Luckily, I did not have to look far, as there is, quote unquote, a branch of the Underground Railroad running across my very own campus. And this was the class that I began co-teaching with Tyus and John, where we started to study this trail, this trunk of the Underground Railroad. Beginning at the Olentangy River, one of Ohio's main waterways, 5 signs wind their way across the now culverted Neil Run Stream, which you can see kind of highlighted here in yellow. The first sign's placement indicates that those seeking liberation moved north along the river until arriving at the stream, where 2 towering sycamore trees would verify the route to safety. Then, as the signs further narrate as you process through the campus, the stream led freedom seekers across the boggy lowlands of the Neal family farm, passing by structures, orchards, and fields until arriving at a house sited above the Iuka ravine. And it was there at this dwelling, enshrouded in thick vegetation and overlooking the branching stream, that the Neal family homestead welcomed those traveling the Freedom Train. That's a direct quote from the signs. The house itself absorbed freedom seekers, concealing their presence in hidden walls and secret passages until successfully delivering them to the shores of Lake Erie and onto freedom in Canada. It's a nice story. It's also a story that is completely false. So installed in 2006 by the Ohio Staters, a philanthropic alumni and student organization, the signage is difficult to verify. University facilities has no knowledge of the signage, and the campus landscape architects have not responded to any of my inquiries. I know, right? Kel surprise. The signage is so subtle that even the alumni group sponsoring them does not recognize the project on their website. And the only record of the signs within the university archives is an email attachment containing an invoice for their installation. In taking a closer look at the history ascribed in the signs, I realized that the stories were told not about the people or the places of where their signage was located. And sadly, this beautiful animation is not perfectly timed, so just, I'm going to catch up here with a second, but I'm learning Keynote. For example, in the second sign, the narrative describes the work of John Rankin and John Parker, abolitionists who worked in Ripley, Ohio, nearly 100 miles away from the sign. And the signage claims that these men directed freedom seekers to the Scioto River, which then branched to the Olentangy. However, I cannot find any record, even in the dubious Siebert archive, but cannot find any documentation or verification of this being a landscape feature that people used. And so I started to wonder where are they getting this idea from? I also cannot find any mention of the Neal Run or even a sycamore tree. And while the rest of the information on the sign is factually accurate, there is a leap of imagination to thread the Olentangy to the Neal Run into this story, which puzzled me and asked me to think about these signs as they are located here and why these stories, of course, are being told here and why on university lands. There, got it right. So in 1812, Columbus, Ohio was surveyed and laid out and soon selected as the state capital. Centrally located and well connected, the city quickly grew through the simultaneous development of government and civic infrastructures, establishing the new capital as an economic and social center. William Neal, an entrepreneur from Kentucky, found opportunity within the city's burgeoning infrastructure, and he obtained regional mail delivery contracts, established the Ohio Stage Company and Neal Moore stage lines, and helped found the first Columbus Railroad. His prosperity led him to purchase 300 acres north of Columbus in 1827, where over the next 4 decades he acquired more land, established a farm, and built several homes for his family. The Morrill Act established the Ohio Agriculture and Mechanical College, also now known as OSU, in 1873. The college trustees purchased the Neal Farm as the new university site, noting that the campus was centrally located in the state, but strategically located away from the bars and gambling houses permitted within Columbus city limits. The farm also featured bogs, woods, an existing freshwater spring, which would provide adequate water for the new academic population. This conflation of landscape and water is where the mythology of the Underground Railroad finds its strategic foothold within the Ohio State campus imaginary. As previously mentioned, the first sign connects the Neal Run Spring with the Olentangy River, thereby linking, I think, many of our assumptions about how fugitive movements north might coincide with the origin story of the campus. The signs wind along the campus's low-lying areas, passing by the lakes, the sycamore trees, and the bygone bogs, suggesting that path leading from the river to sanctuary. And the last sign, located at now the Ohio Union, which is our student center, marks the site of the original William Neal home and describes the continuation of the route beyond the campus grounds to safety at the main family homestead. Topography continues the story into the Iuka Ravine, a distinct landscape that breaks the level, gridded ground of city and campus. Historically, the ravine and stream were important in the placement of the brick house that William Neal built for his family in 1856. The home on the hill, as it was known, was renamed Indianola by William's youngest son, Captain Henry Neal. An early enlister in the Union Army, Henry was wounded during the 1862 Battle of Iuka near Indianola, Mississippi, a site known for its curative spring waters. After the war, Henry took ownership of the brick house, and during this time before the Civil War, it is presumed that the house became part of the Underground Railroad. This word presumed is where the history of the Underground Railroad, Ohio State's campus, and the Indianola house become grossly unsubstantiated. The Neal House still stands on Indianola and 15th Avenues and is currently occupied by the Kappa Sigma fraternity, which states on its website, the house's history is muddled, but speculations have been made. Indianola was said to be used as an Underground Railroad station by use of hidden tunnels in the house. The house's reputation as an Underground Railroad station is given further credence by a palette of mysterious pochés. Secret panels, non-architectural walls, tunnels, hidden rooms, secret passages are described across decades of sources. One of the strangest and most confident speculations asserting that the house was a station is the claim that a tunnel extends from the Olentangy River all the way to the Neal House. Over and over again, articles recite the presence of the tunnel that begins in the furnace room, which reportedly at one time ran all the way to the river, serving as a means for smuggling fugitives from the river into the house. The tunnel is now blocked off, but winter months reveal its path, the snow tending to melt far more quickly on the roof of the underground passage than on the surrounding areas, end quote. So this dubious statement was first published in the Columbus Dispatch in the 1950s, and it's been carried forward many times, most recently in a 2021 PBS News clip for Curious Sea Bus. There is no verification that a tunnel ran from the house to the river. And aside from questions about who would have constructed a mile-long tunnel in 1856, the paternalistic idea that men and women escaping slavery made it hundreds of miles into Ohio, and through so many impossible threats to at long last reach the Neal Run, that safety would then be provided by an underground tunnel owned and operated by white abolitionists undermines the agency and ingenuity of the Black men and women escaping slavery. And here I want to take a minute to share some absolutely fantastic research that two of my students, Elizabeth Reichen and Dominic Somby compiled about the house. So we can see here that the house has had this kind of beginnings of it's being remodeled. Hold on. So we can see here with the story, and the house was remodeled in the 1918. And here you can see the legend of the house. So in 1957, this is where we start to see the legends, and this is in the campus lantern. And the claims there are false passages and false concealed passages and false ceilings. By 1967, we've gone from concealed passages to many secret passages. We now have also added full of tunnels. The tunnel from the basement to High Street has been replaced now by the basement to Olentangy. Now we have actually 4 secret concealed passages. The house is not full of tunnels anymore. It's now 3 tunnels. There's a secret room as well as a tunnel through one of the porch pillars. And so the final claims of these legends have been reiterated so many times, passed on, that it then becomes a kind of fact, which I believe then thereby inspires a lot of other claims that are happening inside of the house. So I'm realizing as I was sharing this, I think I forgot a key detail. The house was renovated in first renovated in 1819. Excuse me, 1918. I just flipped those in my mind. The house was renovated and was done so by an architect where they took the original Swiss-style house and renovated that with the Virginia colonial on top of it. Luckily, we found the documentation for this in the Ohio archives. And so we found the original architect's renovations. I believe that much of these renovations are a result of all of this architectural renovation, that all of the Underground Railroad is a result of the renovation and not actually as a result of secret rooms. So we began by unpacking the architectural blueprints that we found and starting to make a model of the original Swiss-style house that we like to call, and then the understanding of what pieces of the Swiss house were taken away, what additions were made, how do we start to become and sort of craft the sort of narrative about this house. The house was then wrapped in this Virginia colonial kind of presentation. So one of the really interesting things that Dominic and Elizabeth started to do is they were drawing this image of the 2 houses living side by side, like the ghost of one house inside of the other house. And that they could start to think about the Swiss house and the Virginia colonial house starting to oscillate back and forth in time. And so this trick becomes kind of a fun one for us to take a look at. Here we see the Swiss house and a section cut of the house with the elevation beyond, so you're kind of seeing that scene. And then it becomes the fraternity house, and they imagine the different ways that one might occupy those spaces inside the fraternity house. And so side by side, you can start to see, here's the Swiss house, here's the fraternity house. And when we presented this to the board of trustees of Kappa Sigma, this was a really kind of fun experiment that they had those 2D glasses, and you can kind of flicker back and forth and see the house within the house. And as we presented this information to the fraternity board of trustees, they all agree there's no way that this house was part of the Underground Railroad, or at least it may have been part of the Underground Railroad, but the architecture was not doing the work of the Underground Railroad. And this became a super fascinating thing for us to think about. So we started to build a model of the house, and this is a kind of data visualization architectural model moment where in solid white, we have this kind of 3D print. This is the Swiss-style house from 1842, the original. And then in transparent blue is the 1919 Virginia colonial that has been added. And then in orange is the 1970s edition. So we can see, like from above, here's the original house. The elements that are in clear plexiglass, those are the ones that went away. So when they wrapped the house, or they added this portico facade, they added a couple of other things. They also removed some chimneys to make the house feel less like a Swiss house and more like a Virginia colonial, which aligns with the Kappa Sigma fraternity's heritage. This is where you can see the house, the Swissness of that house. And here's that kind of comparison so that you can start to understand that. So the parts about the house that are often spoken about as being Underground Railroad, I want to highlight for you. It's this sort of shaded area right here. These are the secret passages. So when I toured the house, I was like, show me the secret passages. And those secret passages exist, and I'll show you in another animation just a second, between the walls of the original Swiss house and the blue renovation. And so you can see here, I kind of pulled the model apart. It's this little core right here that I've highlighted over here, and also the wrapping around into under that pitch. That is the space that the Kappa Sigma alumni identify as being part of the Underground Railroad. And let me see. I've made this little video. So this is in the office. I'm taking off the reno, pulling this part apart. And that stack right there is the part that everybody starts to point to. It's a closet, main entrance, and then a kind of foundational wall underneath it. It's next to the chimney, and it has some potential relationship with some of the chimneys of the house. Sure enough, we found this little space right there, that sort of bracketed space on the first floor of the existing house. That's the space that is kind of shows itself as being the thing that everybody gets concerned about, or they point to this little square right here. And it traces its way through the house. In the basement, you can see it very clearly right there. It's a very solid kind of room. And it is a bit peculiar. And you can see here in the renovation, it kind of maintained itself as other things around it started to become more built out. But it was probably, it was part of, as an architect, I look at this, I'm like, okay, that's probably a good like foundational sort of structure. It aligns with some of the chimneys nearby. It's the entrance to the house. It doesn't strike me as completely out of the blue that you might have a space like that. But that then starts to kind of untangle some even further questions. And that brings me into the second theme of some of the work that I've been studying. If we're still thinking about the spaces of the Underground Railroad are really entangled with the idea of who made the Underground Railroad and what spaces made their Underground Railroads. So the work that I did for the Crossings exhibition started to connect some of these research ideas about how do we present information about the Underground Railroad within a gallery setting. So when first discussing Crossings with Jim Ackerman, the curator, his premise was very clear. He wanted to compare the east to west development of physical infrastructure in the 1840s, such as railroads, canals, and stagecoach routes, against the north to south movement of men and women who fled slavery through the Underground Railroad. And two maps best represented these crossings: Colton's Guide through Ohio through the Midwest, and the Siebert map of the Underground Railroad. So in thinking about how to present this as a kind of animation for the gallery, we were going to have these two maps, but we wanted to take Siebert's map apart and show it with a bit more information. The first step was then to take the historic information or the historic map and put it into GIS so we could start to extract data from that. So that translation became this map of the Colton's infrastructure. I did the same process for the Siebert map. And then you could start to layer and test them on top of one another. You could start to layer the two different data sets that you collect. The thing that emerged at this point was that there was a twinning of infrastructure. And the Underground Railroad wasn't just safe houses coordinated by white abolitionists, but actually a series of unpredictable routes, landscape structures, and spaces spontaneously invented by Black men and women seeking liberation. So the setup of the beginning of this video I will show here. I think I'll show here. Yeah. This is the introduction. And so that original premise of comparing two maps of different types of infrastructures started to present itself inside of this. And considering that this was presented in a gallery, people would be standing. We were lucky to have them captured their attention for 5 minutes. So it was very, very short. And it is running a little laggy, so we'll just enjoy the slow motion of the map. So how do we tell those stories? So if the Underground Railroad was not just safe houses coordinated by abolitionists, but actually was a series of unpredictable routes, landscapes, structures, and spaces spontaneously invented by Black men and women who were seeking liberation, how do we start to use that as the central thesis to start organizing and selecting which stories we wanted to tell? When thinking about who reports on or who has left traces of the Underground Railroad within the archival record, I identify that there are 4 categories. The first is Black men and women who escaped slavery, writing and publishing their own experiences themselves. So this is, for example, Frederick Douglass, William Still. There's a legacy of these kinds of publications being told through the own voice of the person who's telling that story. The second category would be white men and women publishing on behalf of the Black men and women who escaped slavery. So Harriet Tubman's life as told to Sarah Bradford is one of those examples. Another example would be the abolitionists who left the kind of memoirs or their stories themselves, mostly white men, writing to a white audience about the end of slavery, John Rankin being one of those important individuals. And then finally, Black men and women describing their enslavement through interviews, mostly with white women. And so in selecting these 3 stories, we're recognizing that we were selecting different narratives, different audiences, and different versions of that audience. So we're also selecting a storyteller, as many of the accounts are not written by the individuals or the person who is escaping that slavery, but is being represented on behalf. And as a result of that, the dynamics become significant when encountering that archival record. So the 3 stories that we chose, William Wells Brown, Eliza Harris, Edward Moxley, we had different reasons for those things. I'm going to cruise through this a little bit. Edward Moxley was an interesting story because he had a kind of scale that was moving across the page. That it is coming. Okay, Edward Moxley. So Edward Moxley's the representation, which I used at the very beginning of the presentation, kind of shows the breadth from 9 miles south of the Ohio River all the way to Lake Erie. And trying to tell this story both through the representation of a large territorial space, but then also kind of augmenting and changing the scale of certain features, such as the house that he was running from, the wagons, other kinds of like the steamboats that are coming together in that different way. The next project in thinking about William Wells Brown had a much different distance, and his huge amount of space that he had to carry from New Orleans all the way up through Cincinnati and then on to Lake Erie took a different kind of tactic. So we looked at different ways to bring both the map and then the more intimate space of that journey into a space. And I will show this pretty quickly. And I know we got started a little bit late. How am I doing on time? Can I see somebody? I'm fine. I know it's hot in here, but maybe take a little 7th inning stretch. This is the professor and me coming forward. I can tell like some of my students are losing. So as he made his way into Cincinnati, this is where I took this image of Public Landing in Cincinnati, which was the place where he was able to kind of dispatch from the steamboat, pick up a trunk, and kind of hide into the crowd. And so one of the primary ways that people escaped slavery was kind of hiding in plain sight, disguising themselves within the milieu of other kind of representations. The North Star was used to help people orient themselves to the spaces that they were. And so in this case, it was cloudy. He did not know where to go, but when the clouds parted, he had some sense of which direction to move in. And William Wells Brown resided in Cleveland and then helped bring other fugitives from Cleveland to Canada as part of his abolitionist work. You might all be familiar with the story of Eliza Harris. Her narrative is very well known. Eliza was an enslaved Black woman in Kentucky who, when hearing that her child was to be sold to another family of enslavers, escaped in the night through the wintry Kentucky landscape to the Ohio River, where she planned to walk across the frozen river to Ohio with her baby in her arms. And her experience was dramatized in Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became an incredibly popular piece of abolitionist literature. Her dramatic escape has been pictorialized many times in books, paintings, even sheet music. The image of Eliza Harris crossing the breaking ice with her baby is harrowing. It's also a familiar trope from the 19th century. John Gast's American Progress is strikingly familiar with contemporary depictions of Eliza Harris. The physical similarities of flowing hair, billowing dress, determined profile, both depicting a winged angel, fleeing oppression, and leading the way for enlightenment. And as a light-skinned Black woman, Eliza's character formed a sympathetic image of motherly love and bravery, another difficult reason why this story, more than say others, perhaps caught the imagination of America at the time. So I began each drawing by transcribing the notes from the archival record myself. And this might seem like a funny act because I already have the text in a digital form, so why do I need to recreate the words myself? But in my designer's mind, I need to retrace the words slowly to allow for discovery. This act of deliberately typing allows me to see other aspects of the text, and this is a really important step in immersing myself in the journey. I understand the scale of territory that is crossed, of experiences and details that might require different types of visualizations. So this note-taking is kind of a preparation for translating words to images. Levi Coffin's autobiography provided the secondhand account for Eliza's well-known escape from Kentucky to Ripley, Ohio, where she was received and sheltered by the townspeople, including the Reverend John Rankin, a notable abolitionist. From these sticky notes, I then produced this stunning drawing. This is the kind of draft, this map of how we might start to imagine from Eliza's house to John Rankin's house, other stations along the way, and coding the previous notes like, okay, this part, she's in Kentucky. This part, she's fleeing from this is the part where she's crossing the ice. And so then those sticky notes kind of become spatial, a map itself of how to start translating that. When looking for this more information, luckily, Ripley, Ohio is very, very well documented. John Rankin is a notable abolitionist, and his house on the hill is a notable landmark that traces itself through the history of Ohio. And so the story goes that people climb these 100 steps to freedom up to Rankin's house high on that hill. So that then becomes represented with the stairs and placement on the hill. Other participants in the story of the Underground Railroad, John Parker, who was a Black man who purchased his own freedom from slavery. He was a metalsmith, a metal worker, lived on the edge of town, and his house was also part of that. Parker worked as an extractor, moving up and down the banks of the Ohio River, helping people from the water. And this kind of idea of Parker at the edge of the town, Rankin on the hill, one working the kind of messy edge of the river, the other high above, looking for people as they come through. I also then needed to find information about what Ripley, Ohio looked like at that time. Now, these maps are a little bit later. They're about 20 years later or 25 years later. But the texture of Ripley, you can kind of start to imagine and think about these different things. And in looking at the map, I found in a couple of instances where the presence of Black community members would start to become part of the town fabric. In this Wesleyan colored church, for example, the Black AME churches were a big part of bringing the Underground Railroad in and through the different sheltering sort of communities. So the Black community was a huge part of the town of Ripley, Ohio. I was very fortunate then to find this. Now, this church is not on the map and it doesn't exist anymore, but when I was driving around Ripley, I was very excited to find this marker indicating where the church was, which is now a playground. So I put that church into the map to kind of bring in further voices. I don't know that Eliza touched this church. but maybe she did. And it's important to recognize that there are other community members who are coming together to form this. We also need topography, bringing that into the map itself. We had to find out information. I had to find out information about where Eliza was enslaved. And all I knew about Eliza's enslavement was she was enslaved in Kentucky. So in sort of understanding the architecture of prototypical Northern Kentucky plantation houses, this is the old Kentucky home. And looking at it from that one side, it seems a very sort of stable image. Looking at it from above, you can see the longer kind of working aspects of the house. So if the presentation of the house is up front, that long bar that extends beyond it, with the kitchens leading to the gardens, eventually leading into the slave quarters that were behind the house. So that then became the kind of representation of thinking about where Eliza might have been and how she might start to move out of enslavement. In reading literature, especially by Rebecca Ginsburg and Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche, one can start to kind of assemble a palette of landscape spaces, not just the sort of control of the plantation, but also the nuances of reading the fence line, of starting to understand how streams might be connected to larger rivers, reading topography and reading different vegetation. That was part of a Black landscape that was very, very different from the kind of white planters, view of landscape that controlled the plantation. One also needed to understand how ice flows would be formed, and I know just enough about how rivers move to probably be uninformedly dangerous, but thinking about how this ice might start to shift across this river. And this is an image of Cincinnati in the 70s or 60s when it froze. So that kind of became the scale. I'm like, okay, if the Ohio River freezes, what does that look like? How big is that ice? That's going to be sort of different thing. So from this kind of notes of all of those kind of bits of information, here's the story of Eliza Harris as she fled from enslavement to liberation. And she eventually made it to Chatham, Ontario, where she resided. What's also sort of interesting about this, when I first started collecting files for this, I started with the structures. So my first file was John Rankin. And I realized that the file and the organization of my thinking, eventually I had a folder that said Eliza's Red Line. It kind of symbolized or marks for me that, because how do we start to organize and even sequence our archival imagination in our own laptops? I'm like, okay, I have things, I have to connect the things, I'm putting the things into folders. But putting Eliza's Red Line, that was something that had to emerge at the end. It was kind of a fascinating thing. So finally, and I am the last act of my research here, is if there was a kind of, in learning about all of this, I started to notice that there were a lot of twinnings of infrastructures that were happening in the Underground Railroad. Certainly Frederick Douglass, when he escaped out of slavery, he actually took a train. He escaped in the middle of the day. He disguised himself as a free Black man. He borrowed papers from somebody who was said to be free, and he boarded a train, the noon train, out of Baltimore or out of Maryland, and crossed into Delaware. From there, he eventually ended up in New York City and then eventually in New Bedford, where he settled. So this kind of untangles that myth that the Underground Railroad only happened at night. It only happened by lantern or secret passage, but actually the twinning of infrastructure was a very big part of the Underground Railroad. Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche's amazing book, The Geography of Resistance, talks about Ohio, Southern Ohio's incredible furnace industry, and that the furnace industry, having a large community of Black men who were laboring in this highly dangerous environment, became an incredible network of moving out of slavery up to and through Ohio. And the furnaces were part of that big network. And so this is starting to kind of take a look at how some of the furnace operations would start to work, as that this was be a community that one could come into, that could get a job or hide in kind of plain sight as one moved between different aspects of this. So thinking about the twinning of infrastructure, I had this realization when I brought my students to Ripley, Ohio, and down to Lexington, Kentucky for a study trip last year. And we're standing here at this house, which is incredible vista overlooking the river. You can kind of recognize that this is maybe one sort of end story about the story of enslavement or liberation from enslavement. But if we start to look at what's happening across the river on the Kentucky side of things, in Maysville, this is a kind of image of early Sutton's Landing of 1850. This is a painting that appears on the flood walls in Maysville, Kentucky. And Maysville, Kentucky, I want to pay attention to that little house right up there on the hill. That little white house was a big part of the Underground Railroad. It is currently the National Underground Railroad Museum. It's owned and operated by a small Black family that they run this kind of out of their own sort of not-for-profit. It's very kind of makeshift, but it's a really important marker of talking about the ways that we start to hold that history and how I think the sort of representation and positionality of the curators becomes an important part of the story. So when we attended or we visited the museum, looking back across the way to kind of Ripley beyond, there's another representation on the flood wall, which is this false story of quilts, which we can get into all the different sort of false stories. But what I want you to pay attention to is the hills beyond and that incredible sort of trace that's going up the hill. And that is the trace, the buffalo trace, that formed the beginning of the Maysville Road, which was one of the most, the first kind of road systems, first urbanizing space within the kind of development of your American kind of settlements. But it was also an incredibly important space for Native peoples as buffalo would move through here. Therefore, it became like a riparian zone for different animals. It also then brought different people together into that space. There's even on the Maysville Road another representation of that trace. So this space, this kind of geographic opening, formed the ability for people to move from limestone, which is Maysville, on the Ohio River into the heart of the bluegrass. And as I was standing there at the Rankin House looking at this kind of incredible vista, I had to reflect on the fact that we started in Lexington, Kentucky at a plantation. And I lived across the street from the Ashland Estate for many years when I was an assistant professor at University of Kentucky. And in learning about the Ashland Estate, it did dawn on me after started researching the Underground Railroad that the Ashland Estate was not an estate, it was a plantation. And so we went to the Ashland plantation, learned about its different ways that it's starting to embrace and talk about the traces of slavery at Ashland and recognize the people who worked inside of that space, and how Lexington was kind of an end node. So if Maysville is up at the front, Lexington's down here at the end. There's another aspect to the mapping and the history of Lexington that is challenging to think about, and that is the slave auctions that happened quite frequently within Lexington. If we look here at Cheapside, Cheapside Market is next to the court. It's known, kind of named for its counterpart in England, but was the place where court days would happen and everyone would kind of come into town for many, many years, and they would crowd into the space next to the court. They would either conduct their business with the law, or they would buy things, or they would sell things. And so it was kind of this huge madcap. And so this is in the 1880s. You can see how bustling and busy this was. But in the 1860s, or excuse me, the 1840s, Cheapside was the site of human auctions. When I first moved to Lexington, I was really astonished that Cheapside Bar Grill was there for many, many years. I'm very happy to say that it's now been renamed the Horse and Jockey, part of Lexington's own imaginary. But it starts to really kind of ask us some bigger, difficult questions. these two images represent some of the last photographic evidence that we have of a slave auction inside of Cheapside. So you can see the gentleman here raising his arms. He's being sold. And that within the town of Lexington, there were other kind of markers of this vestige of slavery. Old buildings were once, this was one of the jails. And you can see this is not that jail, but there's a space inside of the marker of the map where Black men and women were held before they were sold, or they were brought back forth together. And then they were brought from Lexington back up the Maysville Road to then be put onto a boat at Limestone and to be sold down the river, where that phrase comes from, where they were sent down to Natchez and New Orleans to be sold and put into the workforce of, or the enslavement of the huge plantation culture in the 1850s. So as I was starting to organize some of my ideas about these very difficult spaces, it was also kind of interesting to learn that this space, this big kind of thoroughfare, even though this was also a site of bringing kind of slavery, it was like an economic conduit for slavery, it was also used by people to escape out of enslavement. And so this road was also part of the Underground Railroad. I wanted to start to explore that. And so how could I start to offer a counter mapping to the Maysville Road, which was not exactly about slavery, but it also wasn't not about slavery, it was about economics. And then how do we start to move that forward into another kind of way? Good on time. And so these are just the last few images. So from mapping that, you can start to see the Buffalo Trace, which is then the road of urbanization. Thinking about two maps, the Noli map of Rome, which was kind of a way of cutting through and seeing these different large spaces. Everything that is public space is coded in white. And so it started to become an idea about thinking about this not just as a thing, but as a sort of network of spaces, and also certain isothermal mappings. I then translated some of that into this map, which I started to think about how could I represent the Maysville Road as a network, as a territory, as patches, as edges, as a way that multiple things could come and plug into it and have like a kind of soft edge quality to it, not just a harder edge quality. And so finally, this is the kind of framing of these two things, because I just finished this article for Katie. So in conclusion, I would offer that this work, kind of while grounded in archival practices, does bring kind of historic research into the realms of imagination and deep mapping. And I want to thank you all for your time and your attention. Thank you so much.
I want to make sure everyone has a chance to enjoy the reception tonight, which goes until 7. But I think we have maybe some time for one question in person here. We have a microphone. There are some people online that I'm sure would love to hear the questions. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I will come by with the microphone.
I'm curious if there have been any attempts to map the volume of people that were flowing along these routes, whether in Siebert's archive or anybody else has done that.
I know, because these routes were created by the people who made the route. And so it was kind of individuals creating their own routes and their own spaces. The number of people who escaped out of slavery is quite contested. And so the answer to your question is no. But that would be a very, very challenging, I think, archival, be an easy data visualization project, but a very difficult archival project. Thank you for that.
One more quick one.
Okay, so as a quilter, I have to ask you about the lie of the quilts, because I think the idea was that there were encoded
Yes.
passages or messages in quilts that were hung up.
One of the biggest mythologies there's ever been. You guys, maybe you've heard about this, the quilts. Like, you would hang a quilt and it would have like a code sort of secretly. If somebody who was enslaved had time to make a quilt, they were using it to keep warm. They were not using it to send secret messages. And actually, there is a whole, every year, that idea of the quilts came out, I think in 1996 or 7 by a book. Yeah, do you know about this? Yeah, and it's like a complete fake news book. Like, totally, we're still using that. But it was completely falsehood story. And so the ways that maybe people were communicating is much more, I think Rebecca Ginsburg's scholarship points to like the small kind of a broken fence was far more symbolic than a quilt in the window. And that somebody who knew how to read the fine-grained details of the landscape, such as enslaved Black men and women, knew how to read that as the signal of like, maybe that is a way out, versus like, come to this, there was a rose hanging in the window and that meant you were supposed to go to that. All of that is these wonderful fantasies that we have that tell us about how we signaled these information. More over canapes, right? Okay.